coming to us now is Judge Peter Herbert, OBE. He's a political activist and chair of the Society of Black Lawyers. Judge, over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. If I lose the signal, it's because it's raining here in Nairobi in Kenya, and apparently that affects the reception on the or speed of the Wi-Fi for some technical reason that I don't understand. I'm just going to speak for about 15 minutes because it's getting late here. It's about 9:45 at night. So please excuse me if I'm a bit briefer than I'd intended to be. But it looks like you've had a fantastic program, and thank you for the invitation to Dawn and others for putting what appears to be a very informative and brilliant discussion during the day. What I'll do is give a very quick synopsis of how I got to where I am or was, and then try and give some generalized advice to black lawyers, lawyers of African, Caribbean and Asian descent, or prospective ones. I'm British, that's what my passport says, but in every other respect, I'm not treated as if I am. I was born in Scotland. My father was from Sierra Leone, my mum was English, and I went to a comprehensive and then a secondary school and eventually a grammar school in Northumberland. And I suppose my childhood was interesting in the sense that, like many of my contemporaries that may be listening, that I grew up with sort of Alf Garnett type of racism on television, on the street, and was fairly used to having to fight in the playground and out of the playground when called the N-word and everything else. And, you know, thinking back to those days in the 60s and 70s, it, in a sense, made the racism we face these days not trivial, but it certainly got a bit more subtle and nuanced than it was back in the day. But it's the same story. And so I went eventually to Leicester University. I had a little interaction with Oxford, didn't get in, but probably a good thing. And I enjoyed my 3 years at Oxford University, and I really wasn't sure what to do. You know, if you have a West African parentage, then generally speaking, you've got to be a lawyer, a doctor, or you're not my son. And so it was a very clear choice that, you know, I had to go into law. I wasn't any good at sciences or medicine. And so I did the solicitors exams. I actually failed them, I should add. I spent too much time playing rugby and having a good time and not enough studying. But actually in the process, I discovered that probably being a solicitor wasn't suited to me or my temperament, because I was quite extrovert. I like the sound of my own voice, which you've got to do as a barrister. And I like to argue. So I had a year off, went to France, learned French, washed dishes, skied, and had a great year off. And just pausing there, that's what I'd advocate any young person to do, is actually explore the world. It helps you mature. It probably helps you learn another language. I went to tour the world and only got as far as France, so I didn't do very well. But it certainly gave me a lot of worldly knowledge by the time I came back to the UK and did the bar exams. The bar was a bit of a shock because, in a sense, you step back into some Victorian type of establishment which really had rejected people of African and Asian descent for many years. And I encountered people who had almost an impossible task to get a pupillage. It's a training for a barrister. Solicitors who spent 3 years trying to get a training contract, as it then was, and in-your-face racism. You know, I turn up for interview in Bristol and Nottingham, and I realized that the Peter Herbert that walked through the door was not the Peter Herbert they were expecting. And, you know, within about 10 minutes, you get the sense that you might as well get back on the train to London. And they sort of asked that, you know, why don't you go home? And the why don't you go home did not mean Newcastle upon Tyne. You know, it meant somewhere else on the continent. But I persevered, and I was lucky that I landed at the time when there were about 50 barristers of colour. My late friend Tarnal Mulvaganam from Sri Lanka. There's some marvellous Ghanaian, Nigerian origin, Jamaican, all of us were there, barristers. And it was something where we shared our experiences, and some of them were pretty dreadful. I mean, I was eventually got a pupillage, a training contract at 4 Verulam buildings in Gray's Inn. And I remember a small conversation which went like this. They said, well, there was a group of people outside waiting for interview, and I was sitting in a corner doing some reading. And they said, well, we've got far too many women in chambers. We don't want another one. They actually had one. They said, we've got too many Jews in this place, and you know what they're like. And at that point, I walked out. We weren't even on the list. And to my shame of going out, I saw a woman, I saw a black man, and I saw somebody whose racially looked like a white male, but I wasn't sure. And I had to take time and think, well, what do I do? Do I say something? Do I tell them? And to my regret, actually, my shame, I bit my tongue, went back in, and determined that this wasn't the place for me. But I didn't have the courage to challenge anybody. And I didn't have the courage to tell any of those people there that they're probably wasting their time. So that was an unhappy part of an otherwise fairly interesting and happy training. We have lots of stories, so I won't bore you with all of them. But over the years then, in fact, within a few months, my contemporaries invited me to join the Society of Black Lawyers, which I later chaired. And I had the pleasure of hearing Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and he spoke at the old GLC building. And he was one of the 3 leading intelligentsia who set the tone for the civil rights movement in the United States. And he'd given talk to the Oxford Union when he was 21 years old. And if anything, he was, if you read his autobiography, it's a marvelous expose of just what strives the American civil rights movement and the ramifications it had all over the world. So at the time of qualifying, we had, if we turned on the TV, you might see Muhammad Ali talk and describe the racism that he faced in and outside the boxing ring, his stand on Vietnam. You had the West Indies cricket team who regularly drummed England and Australia all over the pitch. And those were the mainstays. And obviously you had the appalling images of apartheid in South Africa, of lynchings, and a version of the Black Lives Matter in the 60s and 70s. And obviously the assassination of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, the imprisonment of Mandela, and the fact that, Black liberation movement figures tended to jump out of windows with unfailing regularity in South Africa. So we had a fairly active human rights agenda in the United Kingdom with the ANC. And over the next 30 odd years or so, we campaigned. And one of the things that we faced as Black barristers was a lack of work. And in fact, I've just started writing some of my stories. I was going to say memoirs, but I hesitate to do that. And it was about having some synergy with the Black MPs, Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, Keith Vaz, and Paul Boateng were the famous 4. And at the time, they campaigned for a better distribution of work, amongst other things, for Black barristers. And so I was in a predominantly Black set of chambers, 9-stone buildings, which were called ghetto sets, because ghettos were literally the basements on the top floors where white barristers didn't want to practice. And that's where we were. And we were briefed by the London Borough of Islington to do winding up petitions in the Companies Court. On the Companies Court, you would never see a Black face, African or Asian face at all, because this was the preserve of white boys and girls, mostly white boys actually, as barristers. It was very lucrative, and we were never there. So we marched in, including a Chinese origin barrister called Pamela Un, and we did our winding up petitions, which were very simple, very straightforward, but I think they paid the royal fee of £25 a go. We had about 10 each. So this is a lucrative day. And this continued for about 4 months. The looks on the faces of the judges and the other barristers would we'd have got a better reception if we'd walked off from the planet Mars, because that's not where we're supposed to be. And this was, the mid to late 80s. And the assistant solicitor for the London Borough of Islington came in one day, took one look at us, heard the accents, which were varied and rich, and the briefs were withdrawn by the Monday. That was on a Friday. No explanation offered. And, so it was quite clear that being a person of color at that time, you really didn't have hardly had access to work unless it was from your own people. White barristers didn't have a problem because even our solicitors of color, the few that there were, sent them work anyway. So our ability to work was mostly social welfare law, immigration, housing, problem areas, and crime, of course. And so fast forwarding, you know, I was inspired by people like Rudy Narayan, Sigbert Kadri, who founded the Society of Black Lawyers. Rudy was one of the most eloquent barristers that British courts had ever seen, a Guyanese Asian, and amazing person who made the Attorney General shudder when he spoke at the Bar Council. So he was a glorious person to work with, although he had his faults, obviously. And just to give one example, he was accused of disciplinary offences in Birmingham Crown Court as a result of the Handsworth uprising, where we waded in and defended people. And they basically held briefs in more than one court as a QC, things that white barristers did in QCs did all the time. And he was charged with a disciplinary offence of not being in one court at one time and leaving a junior to hold his brief, which was quite legitimate. And he said, oh, look, I'm sure there's been a conspiracy about the Birmingham judges to get rid of me, because he was winning cases as well. He was proved right. And on his appeal, where I spoke on his behalf, there was a letter that the Birmingham judges, led by the sitting judge, resident judge in Birmingham, asking, how do we get rid of this man? You know, as the British once did with a bishop under, I think it was Henry VIII. But anyway, that part of my history is not so great, but certainly Rudy was right. There had been a conspiracy. They tried to get rid of him. The Lord Chancellor, which I think was Lord Hailsham at the time, refused. And Rudy escaped, at least on that disciplinary offence. And, you know, every time the community had a civil defence, whether it was the Mangrove 9, the Bradford 12, it was almost invariably represented by a whole row of barristers of colour. And in that history lesson, one of the celebrated cases was a case in, I think, the late 80s, where a group of Rastafarians had sought to liberate African artifacts from the British Museum. And they argued that how can you steal stolen goods? Because you can't. And they were represented by, you know, a whole array of, I think it was 12 or 9 barristers of colour, African and Asian. And every single one of them got off before an all-white jury. The only one who got convicted was the one who had taken some books on nuclear physics. But it was a really educational way for the British establishment to learn about, you know, anti-racism and how it derived. So fast forwarding, you know, going through those years at a galloping pace, you know, we had hate crime legislation. We worked on introducing race training for judges between 1991 and 1995. You can Google a section 95 of the Criminal Justice Act, and all the statistics that you find in the appalling consequences that you read in the David Lammy review of 2017 were replicated in a report by Dr. Roger Hood in 1992, 25 years earlier, about the disproportional sentencing and bail decisions that African, Caribbean, and sometimes Asian defendants obtain. So these things are nothing new. They're the same problems we've always faced. But as a barrister, I acted in the immigration courts. I became a visitor at Harmondsworth Detention Centre, later became an immigration judge in 1996. Found that I was getting passed over for appointment as a recorder and as an employment judge regularly, and had, you know, my colleagues come and tell me that, you know, why aren't you sitting? And I was like, well, listen, you know exactly why I'm not sitting. It's because of racism, and people like you are standing in the way. Because obviously, you know, when we were not appointed, somebody had to benefit. And generally, it was a white male somewhere who benefited, a fairly mediocre white male at that. And so I, on a personal basis, I was getting a bit fed up. So I wrote to the 5 High Court judges I did know, and there were some very good ones. I mean, some were extremely liberal, came and spoke on behalf of SWAPO in the ANC, and attended Society of Black Lawyers conferences and swapped stories and what we could do to change the system. So Henry Brooks was one. There were several others. And I said, well, you know, I'm getting fed up with this. I think I'm going to go to the Times newspaper if this continues. And I had then an interview within a space of a couple of months, and the easiest interview I've ever had. And I was appointed a recorder in 2003 and an employment judge at the same time. And, you know, it showed that the old white boy network really did work. And it is an illustration of me that, in a sense, you needed to go behind the scenes and use the same old boy network that my colleagues clearly used so successfully for many years. In between, obviously, the community suffered a lot. I mean, the hate crime murders, of this. This had been conducted throughout 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s until the present day, still continued. And the inequality we found when we looked at solicitors applying for training contracts, we found that when we did a study in the early 2000s, that if you had a long Nigerian sounding or Nigerian name or Sri Lankan name, you tended to have to write 130 applications for a training contract. And you're lucky if you got an interview. If you had an English name, then you had to write a maximum of 30 applications with exactly the same 2-1 degree from exactly the same universities, and you got at least 3 interviews, and almost certainly a pupillage or a training contract at the end of it. That hasn't changed. And certainly I was in chambers in 14 Gray's Inn Square, and there was a senior female practitioner who said, well, overheard by a black woman barrister who was later became on to be a senior immigration judge, he said, well, my most difficult clients are all Nigerian. And she promptly dumped the CV of a Nigerian applicants in the bin. I heard about it, went to the head of chambers, caused an almighty fuss, probably as large as I should have been. The woman was removed from the pupillage committee. They reassessed all 400 applications, and they chose a Nigerian barrister who was one of the best I've ever heard. She left the private practice and went to work for a while for the Mayor of London. I think it now is working in the private sector, but extremely talented. And that was only one case that we heard of. And I think for every case you hear of, there are probably 100 that pass silently by and you never know. So the advice for barristers of colour is really 5 things. 1, you have to be supremely self-confident in your own ability. And a book I would recommend, which helped me get through all of those tribulations and trials, is called Staying Power, The History of Black People in Britain. It's 1,000 pages long. It's based on a book written by a Jamaican called Scobie. It's actually authored by, still available on Amazon, excuse me. And it traces the African, Caribbean, and Asian, even Chinese history in Britain from the Roman times through to the mid-60s. And if you ever wondered that you're the first, you're not the first. You're probably not even the 1,001st from whatever part of the country or the world you're from. But that is an amazing history to read. The second thing that you must have is you must have a determination that you will succeed. Certainly, my contemporaries had hustled and certainly used every possible tool in the book to get around the system, get through it or over it. And there are many variables. I mean, some, in a sense, were very quiet on race or diversity issues. Other, like myself, made a lot of noise. But whatever path you take, you have to have the third thing, which is really strive for, certainly as a barrister, to be the best advocate possible. You don't have to look to a European model. I once heard some white UN lawyers come to Tanzania and tell the predominantly African audience how they had developed advocacy. Well, not far from the Rift Valley, they will know, anybody knows their history, that advocacy and oratory came out of the Rift Valley and went to the rest of the world and not the other way around. And then thirdly, you have to have an ability to give back in your own community. And I cannot stress that enough. I don't care what branch of the law you're in, what you want to do, or how much money you want to earn, or how big the car is. It is absolutely essential that you give back to the community. And if you do, you will ensure your self-confidence, your value, and you will always have support. And there will be a day when whoever you are, no matter how bright your academic record, you will need that support. And certainly myself, some of my lowest points, I've been stopped by some black man or woman at the tube and say, you're that lawyer geezer, aren't you? I just want to say thank you for everything you're doing. And those things are invaluable. The fourth thing is not look to the UK to your world. The UK is not your world. The world is a world of colour, it's a world of diversity, and it's a world which did not look, it's not called Boris Johnson, it's not called Donald Trump. And Britain, especially the post-Brexit Britain, is really a mess. So if you want to kind of look for your future, look to New York, look to Jamaica, look to Guyana, look to Tanzania, South Africa. That is where we are from India, from Pakistan. There are some glorious opportunities available in the Commonwealth. And do not ever say, I could not succeed in the UK. The UK is only a tiny part of the world. And so that, in a sense, is the fourth thing. The fifth is travel. You have to get off your backside, get outside the UK, learn a language. If you haven't been home, get home, wherever that home originally was. Talk to your parents and give back. And that comes to the second thing I mentioned, the way of giving back. If you volunteer, and I met white lawyers who give back in the slums of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Now, if a white boy or girl can do that, albeit they might have the money to get there, but we have the ability and affinity, and those countries will welcome you with open arms. I know this because there are 200 Cuban doctors who came to Kenya. You know, they're being paid, but they came. Marvelous reception. So certainly my experiences in Kenya is that it's obviously far from perfect. You'll get a fantastic reception. There's a group I work with called the Pan-African Lawyers Union. Google it. They regularly take interns, and they're crying out for interns who can appear or research cases before the African Court of Human and People's Rights, which sits in Arusha in Tanzania. There are law societies all over Africa which do fantastic work in terms of civil rights, liberties, etc. And your skills, if you want to hone them and see what real hardship is, come back home and you will make a tremendous difference. But do not see South London or North London or even, you know, Edinburgh or Northern Ireland or wherever it happens to be, or Manchester as your home, because those of you who do will miss out hugely. So those are some of the things I would advocate. I've spoken, I think, for long enough, just about 25 minutes, I think, so my time is up. If anybody wants to ask a few questions, you're more than welcome, but thank you.
Fashion and furnishings.
VU Designs. Fashion and furnishings.
Fashion and furnishings.
VU Designs. Fashion and furnishings.
This work is by Kevin Tomlin, who is a music historian, artist and art teacher.